And so I
Hello,
am here with Arturo. How are you
R2.
doing?
You can just call me R2.
R2. Okay.
Yeah,
How are
yeah.
you doing today, R2?
I'm doing great. First time, long time. Happy to be here.
First time, long time. This is the first
Yeah.
time I've heard that in a while. So yeah, we're here to kind of cover a variety of topics. I
Cool.
think that we both are people who kind of get off the beaten path, and
Sure.
we like to go where maybe other people don't go very often. But essentially, maybe give people some insight into what your interests are, what you're kind of thinking about, what's been piquing your interest recently.
Oh, recently. Okay. Yeah, I'm working on something a little bit longer that has to do with I guess it has to do with race and IQ, which I remember you just saying just before the show you didn't want to talk about, but actually only tangentially to do with that. It's actually more about the epistemological foundations of like what we can know. And I've been reading a lot of this philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer, and he's kind of like known as a critic of like the human sciences and the idea that there can be some sort of finitude between scientific knowledge of something like a human being or a group, right? And so I'm really interested in the idea of like mutability or like the ineffectiveness of like the traditional scientific model when applied to human beings and groups. Oh, I can't hear you. You just
Really?
sorry,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. I'm
Yeah, oh,
I'm
yeah, I got you.
I
You're
need
back.
to I need to buy a microphone with a better mute button. So I guess what I was going to comment on there is at the end you said that the scientific worldview is not applicable to human groups. If I were
Well,
to go ahead.
I don't necessarily say it's like ineffective. There's a few things that I feel like we're still not recognizing about the scientific model as applied to a subject rather than an object. Because in the natural sciences, you have the object, and then you can essentially the idea is if we study it enough, we will eventually know it, and we will eventually be able to dominate it. Whereas it's the when you apply that to an actual subject, it seems like we're using kind of like the wrong tools to try to actually understand people.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm a Platonist. So
Okay.
I think that we can understand people by breaking them down into maybe
Okay.
more essential parts. I think that a tripartite model of the human mind is fairly, to me, it's sort of intuitive, but I think there's also evidence for it in terms of the structure of the brain. I believe in evolution, so I think that if
Mm.
biology is a good tool to understand animals, I think it can be a good tool to understand humans. Um, I think where I guess I agree that because humans we have language, and so we're creating this huge complex field of ideas. Animals
Mhm.
don't have that. Rocks don't have that.
Yeah.
And language is deceptive. So when I say that, um, I don't know, for example, I say like, I'm a writer or something, and like an identity that I have, or I say I am a white man, or I say I don't fit into the category of whiteness, or I don't fit into the category of maleness. When I start to engage in these most elementary linguistic identifiers, there's a huge deal of unseen assumptions that go into that. Whereas when we're studying like an animal empirically, biologically, we're not saying, okay, well, the animal said this, but did it really mean that, or did it mean this other thing? Like animals aren't
Sure.
capable
Sure.
of irony, they're not capable of sarcasm. and they're not really capable of self-deception, and they're not capable of guilt or shame. And because humans have guilt and shame, we are much more likely to lie to
And,
ourselves and to lie to other
yeah, an
people.
ego. We have an ego, whereas an animal doesn't, right?
Well,
So
we also have a super ego, and
yeah,
maybe I think that one interpretation of the ego and super ego is to say that you can't have one without the other. That it's the super ego that it's kind of like uh, the Oz behind the curtain. Like the super ego is the mysterious subterranean, in the same way that we say like the id is a subterranean force, like
yeah,
maybe a Chthonian force. Like the super ego is kind of this heavenly force which you can't see, but like angels come down and whisper into your ear and construct the ego. So the ego is kind of the meeting place for the id and the super ego. And yeah, animals don't have a super ego, except we could say in the case of extreme forms of domestication. So like a dog, hits your vase and the vase falls and it shatters on the floor. Sometimes you
yes,
get these videos of dogs where they kind of look guilty. They kind of look ashamed about their behavior. And so it seems like it's possible, perhaps, through sufficient domestication to begin to like develop some form of a guilty conscience in animals, but animals in a state of nature don't have that.
sure.
They have dominance and submission, but they don't have this sense of guilt after the fact. And we're able to conceptualize that. And so when we study ourselves, we have to be aware that there's a great amount of self-deception that we're prone to engage in. And
Yeah,
so it's not as straightforward. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's impossible to use science to understand humans, but I think it's much more challenging than it would be
sure.
for us to study animals or something like that. And
Yeah, no, and that's what I'm saying. It's like I'm saying that the current tools we're using, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying the current tools I think are flawed. And it's like there's a few things that are just for me like tip me off that we're not like doing a good job. For example, the findings in this area when it comes to like racial variation, etc. It's always totally party dependent. Have you not noticed that? You never get like a left-wing scientist who says, actually, oh, the race scientists are correct. And you'll never get a sort of right-leaning scientist that'll say, oh, this is all bullshit, really. It's always completely party dependent, right? Because there's like a kind of identity investment when you're doing that kind of research where you're, like we were talking about before, your ego is kind of like on the line in a weird way that maybe we don't even fully understand.
yeah, I guess I would. I am hopeful and I am optimistic, despite the fact that there are significant challenges. And I think that
Yeah.
um, there are certain questions that are controversial. Um, and I'm gonna mute my audio. There is a little bit of feedback, but like for example, let me think of something that where evolution, for example. So
Sure.
evolution
Sure.
is a scientific theory, not just about animals; it's about humans, and it's saying these are our origins. Like we evolved from primates. We have these cousins, these other primates. We have these Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, Denisovans. They're our cousins. We have an archaeological record, and we can go back in that. And we can study the genetics, and we can determine like this, like Alzheimer's and schizophrenia and these other diseases. Maybe those originate from Neanderthals, for example, or those genes sourced from Neanderthals increase our risk percentage or something for those diseases,
Yeah.
osteoporosis or whatever. And so we can use science to help understand human history, human biology. And I think also science has the potential to influence our future. So, when we're making reproductive choices, understanding our risk propensity for different diseases can help us, determine, okay, in Israel, for example, they've implemented this where you can, a couple can go and get genetic counseling and they can see, okay, what are the risk factors? You have technologies coming out like embryo selection or IVF that are facilitating our future in one direction or another, for good or for evil. That's already happening. So There's aspects of scientific knowledge where I think we have the potential to create genuine understanding despite the difficulties involved. And I think where things get especially hairy is probably when it starts to intersect directly with politics. And I don't think this is just a race and IQ thing. I think it also
Yeah.
is with the environment. I'm an environmentalist. I'm in favor of the environment, but I recognize that environmental policy has, or I should say, the scientific consensus on climate change has a $1 trillion price tag associated with it. It has real world effects based on what we think is true or false. Um,
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you. You said you're in environment, and I didn't really realize this because I was really into the like climate struggle maybe 10 years ago, and I followed it very closely. It seems like I don't know, like after COVID, kind of fell by the wayside. I feel like it's not really getting much airtime as much as it used to. But now there's this kind of divide between the two wings. So the people who are like pro energy, renewable energy, it's all about energy, and then there's other people who are about protecting like biosphere, protecting the ecology, like the sort of ecological wing that are less focused on energy. Where do you kind of fall in that debate, where is it about all renewables and that's the only way forward, or is it about protecting ecosystems?
Yeah, if we're gonna open that up, I would say I'm an ecologist, not an energyist. Um, and but I would say first and foremost, I'm a pollutionist. I believe that pollution is bad by definition, otherwise it wouldn't be pollution. I don't think that CO2 is a form of pollution, strictly speaking. I think it's still an environmental risk because we have cities on the coast, and if CO2 leads to sea level rise, that can lead to economic damage. But sea level rise and CO2 doesn't result in genetic damage. It doesn't result in cancer. It doesn't result
Sure.
in
Yeah.
birth defects. It doesn't result in cognitive disabilities. Whereas if I go to the seashore and I catch a swordfish and I eat the swordfish and I say, that's delicious, I'm going to do that 7 days a week. I'm going to get mercury poisoning. That's bad. I think that companies that dump mercury into the ocean have to be held responsible for that. And I think that it's not a logically impossible ask. You can assess what is the damage. I like seafood. I would prefer to eat seafood 7 days a week. You've inhibited me from doing that, and so we can very easily quantify what the economic loss is and assess it to the companies who participate. One of the issues with that is if one country is dumping mercury into the Pacific Ocean and it's not a participant of like an environmental treaty or environmental regulation, then that affects the mercury content everywhere. So
Sure.
it basically is a global problem, and it requires global solutions. And I think the answer to that is, if you're serious about environmentalism, you have to advocate for some form of tariffs or some kind of economic punishment for countries that don't
Sure.
cooperate with that. And it doesn't matter whether they're big trading partners, small trading partners. If you're committed to that, then you have to punish violations. And so that is not something that's I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. That would be my ideal policy. I think that a lot of the carbon stuff is a distraction, and I think there's problems with green energy. I think that lithium ion batteries are extremely pollutant producing in the manufacturing process as well as the mining process. People don't understand that when you mine for lithium, you're creating a giant hole in the ground, and the mining process is very invasive.
Yeah, so like the way I understand it, and again, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but the wing that is like obsessed with like renewables are like the kind of like progressive neoliberal Davos wing of like the, environmentalist movement, who are like, okay, so fossil fuels are going away. What will replace them? It looks like it's going to be renewables. So we don't even have to, there has to be no sacrifice in terms of economic growth. We hope that renewables will just kind of slot in and be what fossil fuels were, right? So they're kind of just trying to feed this new beast, right? Whereas I guess the more ecosystem focused wing, they don't really have anything like that, because I think they recognize that there has to be some kind of sacrifice if you're going to actually try to address any of these problems.
What I would say is that in terms of sacrifice, I don't believe that we're sacrificing anything. I think what we need to do is start valuing the environment, right? The
Yeah,
environment
sure.
is good. Like, I value clean air, I value clean water, I value clean food. Why? Because when we don't have clean air, clean water, and clean food, we get sick. We get diseases. Diseases cost money. So I think you can put it in purely material utilitarian terms. Now, I have an aesthetic preference for walking in the woods and smelling the flowers, and if Walmart puts up another parking lot, that hurts my soul. But I don't think I
Sure.
need to write a poem about how much I love flowers in order to make like a logical, rational case for this. I mean, we have seen an increase in cancer. We have seen a decrease in fertility. There is a
Sure. Sure.
biological epidemic going. I mean, this is way bigger than COVID. I mean, people who care about, and by the way, it's way bigger than vaccine side effects as well. Like, at least you get a choice. I mean, I know people are, oh, well, it's a vaccine mandate. Okay, well, you can pick up, you can leave. I can't pick up and leave. There's nowhere. I mean, you can go to the Himalayas and there's still microplastics on Mount Everest. There's still
Yeah.
microplastics in the Marianas Trench. So there's no place to run to. I'm not going to go to Mars. I'm not going to the moon. This is my planet. I was born here. We need to fix what we've got here, not trash somewhere else. So let's actually see our environment as having value. It's our commons. Let's take care of it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess what I meant by, yeah, I'm kind of on board with you with all that. I meant like that when I said sacrifice, I meant like there probably has to be some adjustment of living standards, because you're talking about microplastics, right? Well, the whole economy is kind of like underwritten by the fact that plastic is so cheap. So it's like, okay, well, the cost of everything is going up. That's going to have all these knock-on effects. Okay, it's not viable to have this or that enterprise anymore because we don't have plastic. So those kind of adjustments like are more what I was talking about. So you think let's just make them all, let's just like basically tank the economy in order to fix the environmental issues?
Well, I don't think you need to tank the economy. I think what you need to do is you need to say, look, microplastics are harmful. And we have effectively, even in America, we have a form of public health care. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid. We need to assess, we need to give a dollar amount. What is the financial burden on our country as a result of microplastics? Whatever that is, it's $1 billion, it's $1 trillion, doesn't matter. You take that number and then you say there's a volume of plastic being produced every year. And so of that volume, what is the harm? And you create a ratio between pound of plastic produced and healthcare harm in a dollar amount, and then you assess that as a tax, and you say per pound of plastic you produce,
Okay.
here's the
Okay. So it's
tax
kind
that
of
you
like
have to
a,
pay
yeah.
to account
Okay.
for what you've done. So yeah, that would be my approach to it. Now you could say, oh, but that would be disruptive to the economy. Well, one way you could do it is you could say, well, next year it's going to be 1% of the final tax. And then the year after it's going to be 2%. And then it's going to be 3%. So there's ways that you can ease people into that. You don't have to go from 0 to 100 in a single year. You could do it gradually over multiple years. But we need to start that process, and we need to state this is the eventual end goal. This is our ideal. This is where we need to get to. And we have to start somewhere. So I'm happy to start small. I'm happy to start, every pound of plastic produced, it's a 1 cent tax. I mean, that would be something. It wouldn't destroy the economy, but
Sure.
it would be a step in the right direction. And it would set a precedent that we recognize the harm. Because right now, Greta Thunberg and her host of child actors and whoever's paying her, and by the way, Elon Musk is part of the grift too. Tesla is part of the grift too. That they're selling themselves as the big green. We're the green energy people. Okay, there's no recognition of the harm that plastics do in public policy. We sometimes ban certain harmful chemicals, but we don't tax certain harmful chemicals. We have a very binary system where it's either totally legal or it's totally banned. And that's not appropriate. because there are some industrial processes that are very important for keeping people alive. For example, let's say I'm a doctor and I need to have a life saving machine, but this machine contains some mercury or it contains some plastic. Are we going to just ban mercury and plastic and then not be able to save people's lives? No, but we need to tax it so that for every for every bit of pollutant we're producing, we are paying back into the commons to maintain a balance. Because right now we're running out of balance. I mean, our pollution deficit just continues to increase every year. And so if we want to slow that down with the eventual goal is we want to clean up the earth. We want to clean up the microplastics. We want to clean up the mercury. But to get that point, we have to first slow down what we're producing, and then we can think about actually reducing. That would be the eventual goal. And part of that is going to help by Mother Nature, because Mother Nature does a great job of degrading all sorts of things, with an exception of these forever chemicals are very difficult. So, that's obviously when you're creating tax policy, you have to consider how long is this pollutant going to be in the environment? Is it going to be 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? And you have to account for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with when it comes to like collective action on like any of these issues, the difficult thing is that the risks are like so diffuse. Like we're not, no one's sure who's actually gonna be stuck with the bill at the end. So it's kind of like, oh, like there's nothing that really can compel us. And I mean, it's kind of made even worse in the U.S. because they've got the private healthcare. Because it's like, in a situation like Western Europe or something, it's like, oh, the collective action, the necessity is right there for you. We're going to be spending more money on our healthcare system if we don't do something about this. Whereas, like I said, it's kind of like the blame is amorphous. The risks are diffuse when it comes to trying to get people to actually see their own interests in doing something about this.
I totally agree. I think that there's a huge problem of, oh, well, this only increases the risk of cancer by 1%. So, oh, whatever. And it's like, you understand that an increase of 1% is like thousands of people dying. It's only going to kill off 1% of the population. It's like, okay, that's 3 million people. So it really, what it takes is it takes intelligent people who can overcome some of that democratic logic, where you're never going to. The problem with voters is I've seen this happen my entire life, is Islamic terrorism. You're going to get blown up by a Muslim. Watch out. The Muslims are everywhere. And it's like, they're 2% of the population. Vast majority of them are not terrorists. You're more likely to be shot by a cop. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. You're more likely to be eaten by a shark or maybe even a whale. I mean, this is just not something I understand from a symbolic angle. Like, the government has a duty to stop these terroristic acts and so on. But to target a small group of people who are mostly law-abiding and, normal people, and to brand them and call them all terrorists, I mean, that is this flaw of democratic logic, where everything is anecdotal, everything is symbolic, everything is, it's like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and whatever's on the media and whatever is on the boob tube, that's what people can conceptualize. They're not
Yeah.
able to conceptualize statistics.
Yes. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the fact that after 9/11, there was like so much, like it just became the topic, like 24 and Homeland. It just became like, okay, so the terrorists are coming, the terrorists are coming. So that's like a story that people can conceptualize, and there's something, oh, okay, that's a problem. Whereas it's really hard to tell a story about like slow decline of the environment, or like, destroying the environment slowly over a period of decades, right? It's a really hard story to kind of to get people jazzed up about.
Yeah. The situation where we have to jazz people up to get anything done, um, I'm just not a jazzer. I'm just not going to riz the
Sure,
population and
sure.
jazz them, and I'm never going
That's why.
to.
That's
Yeah.
why neither of us are politicians, because that's what I think a politician does, is they're able to take something that's like kind of a problem and make it people's make people care about it, right?
Yeah, they're able to make it into like they're eating cats and dogs, you know? So this is your
Exactly. Yeah.
if you love your cat, if you love your dog, you're going to vote for Trump because he's going to protect your
Sure.
pets. Um and you know that is not I'm never going to win under those
Mm,
rules. If the rules are I have to use all this rhetoric and deceive people and blow things out of proportion, make mountains out of molehills, I'm not even gonna try. So I kind of given up on that, and my approach is like I can speak to some intelligent, thoughtful people, and I can make some arguments, and maybe intelligent people are going to be able to make decisions independently
sure.
of
Sure.
whatever's going on in the democratic process, and I'm hopeful about that for the same reason that like right-wing conspiracy theorists are despairing about the future because they say, you know, it's these globalists and they're taking over and they're not democratic and they want to eliminate the global population. And I'm like, wow, that's impressive. Like I'm really proud of these guys that they're able to overcome all these institutional flaws in our society, and they're able to like get things done without the consent of the masses. That's pretty impressive. I mean, whether I agree or disagree with this or that policy, it's like, okay, you're proving that a small, dedicated minority of smart people can get things done, and so that's why I'm hopeful that things can get done, even though these sorts of things, like talking to the average person on the street, they have already fallen asleep or they're looking at their phone, they're scrolling through Instagram, they've totally checked
Yeah.
out. They're not listening to what we have to say. And I say it's okay. I mean, I say if you don't want to, if you either are not capable of participating in this discussion or you're not interested, then you should not have a voice and your voice is not in order to have a voice, you need to listen. And that is my belief. And if you're not capable or willing to listen, you should not have a voice. And so, I mean, maybe that in terms of freedom of speech, absolutely, I believe in the scientific process, and so I think people should be allowed to say contradictory or controversial things as long as they are attempting to say it in a rational, logical, intelligent way. If people are just kind of how do I say this? They're sort of crying out in emotional, that egoic, selfish, like, I want, like I was watching the videos of the people in Springfield, Ohio, and their complaint was that the Haitians are stealing our welfare. And then they were saying, and I've seen those Haitians, and they'll take a van and they'll just fill that van full of hundreds of cats, and then they go off to their barbecue. And like this is, and I as a person who have a very different temperament and be like, I just can't imagine a situation where I just whole cloth make up total lies and feel okay about myself. Like I would feel guilty. I would feel embarrassed. But
Mm,
there's a whole spectrum of human behavior, and everybody's different, and as it turns out, people who are kind of left behind in these post-industrial zones like the Rust Belt, Springfield, Ohio, they're people who are downwardly socially mobile. Otherwise, they wouldn't be living there. They would be living somewhere else. They would have moved by now. They would have gone to college. And so the fact that they haven't done that, there's a kind of selection for a personality type of victimology of, maybe I can't get ahead, or how do I justify that? I'm not going to engage in self-criticism because maybe it would be pointless or it would be difficult. And so instead, I'll just blame the Haitians, or I'll blame the globalists, or I'll blame, whoever's available, I can scapegoat them. And then, it leads you to this dark place where you just start making up lies and atrocity propaganda about people who are fleeing a very desperate situation. And we can criticize mass immigration and so on,
sure.
in the way that it's done, and should you take all of them and put them in one single town, and we can criticize, like, how much welfare should they get, how much, whatever. But in general, it is a human, well, I guess my original point was just to say that I can appreciate the idea of freedom of speech is like the founding fathers conceived of, like, well, we're all landowning gentlemen here, so if you want to criticize the Bible, then that's quite chip chip cheerio with me, as opposed to just like people emoting, people just kind of like screaming at their TV and saying fuck you, I hate the Democrats, or like, that to me is not freedom of speech. That is, I mean, I guess what I would say is I believe in freedom of ideas, not freedom
Okay.
of screaming, and freedom of hating. That's how I would phrase it.
Okay, so basically, if I understand you, you'd like there to be a bit more decorum in the discourse, kind of.
Yeah, I mean,
By
people, I guess. Um, I mean, I think there are a lot of people like a Terry Davis, someone who's probably rude and maybe is gonna use some racial slurs and is like weird and antisocial, but he's intelligent, and maybe he's crazy, but he's intelligent, and there's some kind of like substance to the idea. Like, I'm creating an operating system and it's like a religious project, and like I don't want to restrict Terry Davis from doing that. I think weird people should be allowed to do weird things as much as possible, and that's the kind of freedom I embrace. But I don't think that like uh, at least on a cultural level, whatever the legal
yeah,
regime is, I just personally, when someone says, my freedom of speech dictates that I have the right to, scream at people in a public place and harass people and troll people online and send them death threats and things like that. Um, it's like, okay, maybe legally under the First Amendment that's protected, and there's a case to be made that like once you start attacking the First Amendment, then it's a slippery slope, and then we don't have any free speech at all. Okay, fair
sure.
enough. I'm not really making like a legal prescription. I'm just saying on a personal level, when I see people engaging that behavior, I don't think, oh yes, of course, this is just part and parcel of freedom of speech. I think, as the founders originally created freedom of speech laws, they still prohibited obscenity. And that is what I think most of what passes as free speech today is actually obscenity, as would be recognized by the founding fathers.
Okay.
And in fact, they also allowed for libel laws. So if you lied about somebody, if you slandered somebody, if you said something about somebody that's not true, that would be punishable. You would have to pay damages or a settlement. And in fact, they had dueling. They had legalized dueling. So if you said something
Yeah,
terrible,
yeah.
I could say, you know what, we're gonna have a duel and I'm gonna shoot you. So it was like there were consequences for people just being hateful, being obscene, being slanderous, telling lies. And so when I see the people of Springfield being goaded
But
by a certain apparatus of the media to tell these lies, I think like, this is not something we should tolerate. If somebody's going out and telling lies, like, you should be under some threat of prosecution for knowingly just making up lies, or whether it's the citizens themselves or the reporter or the media organization. I don't know. Maybe again, I understand there's a cost to attacking freedom of speech, and I
yeah,
don't want a totalitarian regime where you can't say anything weird or controversial. But I do think there's a distinction between freedom of ideas and freedom of obscenity.
yeah. I was gonna say, the way I approach it is, if they allow you to do it, it probably doesn't have an effect. So like, I see the freedoms that we enjoy like in Western countries as like a sign of the confidence of the regimes of those countries, right? So here in China, they don't really have. I mean, they're starting to get the same confidence. Like, they're starting to loosen up on things. People will post relatively incendiary things with seemingly no consequences here, but there's still this kind of insecurity on the behalf of the regime that they can't really let the conversation get too out of hand, because they don't really know. They 30 years ago looked at what happened to the USSR when they did that, and that still kind of haunts their dreams, right? Whereas I think that the sort of liberal democratic regimes in North America and Western Europe are very comfortable with these conversations being used to manipulate, because they don't really see their core interests threatened at all by these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the strategy is kind of I mean, these are diverse sets of issues, right? So I don't have like a general theory that again there is a rule. Like I don't think there's necessarily a monopolar ruling Western elite that all have the same desires and ideas. I think there's competition and there's disagreement. And I think environmentalism is an example of that. Elon Musk made a lot of money riding on these this federal welfare for lithium batteries, and there are other elites who make their money off of hydrocarbons, and they would prefer that we didn't have those subsidies and that we relied
Sure.
on oil and gas. And so I think there are those disagreements, and I think um, oftentimes what happens is public discourse and debate has become a national sport in a way that I don't think it was in the past. I think that, to an extent, we've had controversial elections in the past. We've had elections where, people were fired up about it. So we've gone through cycles of polarizing and unifying as a country. I mean, the 1930s was incredibly polarized in the sense that you had Charles Lindbergh and Father Coughlin on the one hand, and then you had FDR on the other hand. And eventually, that process of polarization was resolved in World War II. We came together. We decided, sorry, Father Coughlin, you don't get to talk anymore. Sorry, and then basically Charles Lindbergh voluntarily decided to shut up and just join the war effort. So, that was a cleanup effort and said, look, we need to tidy up our country because it's a little bit too crazy. This isn't tolerable. And it wasn't like the United States government said that you can't have I don't know, sir. You could write a book. You could have like an anti-Semitic book, or you could still have those ideas exist. It was just they said there's this thing called mass media. It's called radio, and this is a dangerous technology that's bad for public unity, and so we have to restrict that. And so that's part of the American tradition. Again, going back to the founding fathers, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the idea that the mass man is allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not a normal thing in American history. What is normal is to say you're allowed to criticize the Bible, you're allowed to consider God in whatever way you want to, or you're allowed to deny the existence of God. You're allowed to go to church or to not go to church, or whatever church, or you're allowed to start a church. You're allowed to, have sort of different ideas about. I mean, you can be a monarchist in America. We didn't kick out or expel the monarchists. They're the Cavaliers. A lot of them self-deported, but we didn't say like it's illegal to be a monarchist. And so, if you have a different idea about how the government should be formed, you're allowed to have those ideas. And so there's a distinction between again just this sports like activity of you're screaming for your team, you're screaming against the other team, but there's no substance to it. I mean, this election in 2024, and I think you're kind of alluding to this, there's not actually, on certain fundamental issues, I mean, I think they are distinct candidates, and I have my own preference, but in other ways, I mean, Kamala's sort of running to the right. Trump is kind of softening on certain things. He's
Yeah.
whether it's on immigration or abortion, like again, like these issues maybe are still significant and important and whatever, but it's just strange because you'd think as the candidates run to the center on policy issues, maybe that would clamp down on the polarization and people would be kind of less violent and less hateful. I still don't think we've figured this out. I still don't think we're over this. And yeah, it's going to take some kind of top-down institutional reform where you have, some kind of leader, whether it's an FDR type figure or someone just says, you know what, enough is enough. We're done with polarization because we got to unify because we have a crisis as a country, whether it's an economic crisis, a military crisis. Like we have to deal with this, so people are just going to have to settle down. But yeah, I think in terms of the scientific process, I'm a strong believer in scientific freedom. If you have a scientific theory about human biology or psychology or spirituality, I think we got to protect that stuff, because we've been proven throughout history to constantly be learning new things that contradict what everyone thought was the truth, and so the only way we're gonna learn and grow is by allowing room for that. But I think it's kind of like the principle of tenure. Like, you're a professor, you have a PhD, you've gone through the ranks, and so now you have the freedom. I actually think we should be granting tenure like really easily. I think a lot more professors should have tenure, and we should be much more aggressive in granting tenure, so that if you're a kooky professor, as long as you've demonstrated like you have the skills and you have the ability and the competence, then yeah, I want to expand freedom of speech for essentially in academia. You could say among
Yeah.
the priest class, but among the, we're talking about, should a media corporation be allowed to go around Springfield and report on hundreds of cats being barbecued and so on? It's like, if that can be demonstrated to be false, I think, you could reasonably hold those people liable for damages.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there's a, I had a few things I wanted to interject there, but yeah, what you were talking about how the level of discourse is so partisan, and one thing that I've been kind of thinking about lately, and especially like, yeah, you go back and kind of read what you were talking about in the 1930s, is like, yeah, that was polarized. However, there's this sense of like patriotism in that polarization where like when it came to like, I don't know, the perspective of the world, they were all like at the end of the day Americans, that I don't think after the 60s I feel like that started going away, and now that's like at its lowest ebb, where it's like people would rather like people would rather see like America lose if their own preferred candidate isn't in power, right? Like you're kind of cheering against the president that you don't like in a lot of ways, which I think is pretty mind-blowing if you really look at like, the history of the country, when like, eventually people would kind of, I think, fall in line in a previous era, whereas now it's kind of like you almost have like two countries, which is like, I mean, not a very deep or insightful point. It's pretty common nowadays, but yeah. And then, sorry, what you said something about, oh, your idea about permanent tenure. Yeah, no, I actually think that's a pretty wild idea, and I think that like, I mean, academics already are getting a pretty shitty deal in the sense that they don't get paid anything. So this could be like a kind of additional form of compensation. It's like, okay, you're maybe not going to make money, but you'll have this protected position, and you'll be able to do the research that you want to do regardless, come what may. So no, I think that's a great idea, to sort of add to the compensation that or the lack of compensation that professors get now.
Yeah, yeah, I think that we need to massively expand spending in education, because that is our economy. We don't have an agricultural economy. We don't even have an industrial economy. I mean, there's an argument to be made that China's kicking our ass, and we need to start getting back to an industrial economy. But be that as it may, I think we can do both at the same time. And we should do both. And I think they actually complement each other, because if we are going to bring back industrialism, it's not going to be through like brick and mortar traditional. We're not the factories aren't what they used to be, and that's true in China. A
Yeah.
Chinese factory in 2024 is not a Chinese factory in 1996 or something. These are totally different places. I mean, the Chinese are
Well,
using robots; they're not using slave labor.
yeah,
Uh,
well, on the other hand, like the wages are still like depressed to a degree that like Americans couldn't come to terms with. So like if you work in an EV factory in China, for example, like they're not making, like an American worker would never work for that amount of money. They couldn't work for that amount of money. The cost of living is too high. So like that, yeah, you're right. That ship has kind of sailed, of like, turning the clock back on, reindustrializing the country in many ways.
Well, I'm. That's not exactly my point. It's that if we are to reindustrialize, it's not going to be through the same methods that we initially industrialized. In that, it's going to be much more automation heavy. And so, I think MAGA Republicans, conservatives, Trump, whatever, they have this conception, and even some Democrats as well have a conception that reindustrialization means giving the coal miner back his job, giving the factory worker back his job. And I think to your point, where you're correct, is we're not going to reindustrialize from the bottom up. We're not going to give industrial
Yeah.
jobs back to working class people. That's not happening. But in terms of industrial production, I think we can produce more steel. We can produce more cars. We can produce them, make them better than they are. We can make them cheaper than they are. We can make more of them than we're currently making. And I think that's important. But we have to distinguish and understand that's not going to save the working class. What it's going to do is it's going to give a lot more software engineering jobs to AI specialists and robotics engineers and things like that. So I do think we should reindustrialize in that sense, but I have no illusions about, oh, this is going to save, it's going to revitalize Springfield, Ohio. No, it's probably going to be, I mean, we could build these things in the middle of the Canadian tundra or something because, they all you need is like a few managers to oversee and make sure there's no
Sure.
glitches and to check in every once in a while. But these are semi-autonomous. They require a lot of
So,
initial capital. But yeah,
yeah.
they're not traditional factories. And I think that because I have this vision of reindustrialization, which is focused on automation and robotics, I think that in order to support that, we need to massively overfund our education system so that we have really competent, intelligent people who have the skills and the resources and the incentives to go into these fields. I mean, we I don't think are doing as good as we could do. I mean, our education system is better than many other places in the world, but I still think we could do better in terms of uh, going to really smart kids, 18 years old, and saying, look, you could have this great job. College is going to be free. Like, there's no reason that you need to go into a trade. There's no reason you need to, do something else. Like, we if we provide the incentives, then I think it's an investment in our future and it'll pay itself back. And conservatives are afraid to do that. They think it's socialism. They think, we're just wasting money on gender studies degrees.
Yeah, no, like what I see, if I understand you correctly, what you're kind of talking about is like a GI Bill for like gifted teens, right? You're basically talking about like a massive government investment plan in education, and that's a great idea, actually. I think so. Um, yeah, and I did want to like circle back to something you were saying a second ago, which is like, yeah, we're gonna have, or the proposal is to have this automated heavy reindustrialization. So then I still don't then understand the logic of like mass immigration. Is it basically just we're going to become an even bigger consumer society, but we'll have all of these extra people that we have no exactly jobs for? I mean, I understand what you're saying about we're going to need all these software engineers, but I don't think you need quite as many software engineers as you used to need, blue collar guys. So it's like, yeah, these two policies seem almost at odds to me.
Yeah, I don't defend mass immigration as such. My ideal immigration plan is 1,000 people per country per year, with an exception for military allies. So Japan, NATO, countries like that, Australia. I think you can be play fast and loose with the immigration rules because look, if we're planning at some point to fight and die alongside each other, then I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we can have open borders with you. But everybody else, yeah, I would say 1,000 people per year, which, there's like 200 countries in the world. So that's like 200,000 immigrants per year. It's not zero, but it's less than we have now. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
millions and millions of people. And I think the benefit of that is actually, um, I, I think that when you have like 1,000 people is not much. I mean, they're saying in Haiti it was like 20,000 per year. I think reducing that by a factor, of 95%, I think is going to decrease a lot of this cultural friction that goes on. I don't desire to see that. And I also think that there is a form of meritocracy and selection that just naturally happens. If there's only 1,000 slots, people are going to compete for those 1,000 slots. Even if we don't explicitly have a merit-based system, you're effectively going to have a merit-based system no matter what. And so, that's what I would kind of desire. I understand that, like, the Democrat Party has been running buck wild with Biden and the open border situation. I'm not super worried about mass Hispanic immigration in particular. I think
Yeah.
it is a particular form of immigration. It's not eminently desirable. I don't think it's going to save the country or even make the country better necessarily. But I do think it's distinct in the fact that Mexico is our neighbor to the south, and that if we eventually have a manifest destiny for this entire continent, not just Canada and the United States, but if we want to integrate Mexico, then we're going to have to come to some kind of cultural reconciliation with Mexican people. And, in light of that fact, is mass Mexican immigration the worst thing in the world? No. I think ultimately, if you see that we're going to unify these countries anyway down the road, then I think that kind of puts things in perspective. Now, I think a lot of people who are critical of immigration, what they'll say is, oh, mass immigration means Brazil, mass immigration means South Africa, mass immigration means Haiti. And that's actually not true. Mexicans are not Haitians, they're not South Africans, they're not even Brazilians. And so, too, I think in America we have this racial binary dating back to slavery, where we place everyone in the category of you're either white or you're black. And it's just not an accurate way to look at the world or to look at immigration. That doesn't mean that, in my preference, that we're having basically we have this game we play where we allow the cartels to do whatever they want in Mexico because Mexico is a quote unquote sovereign state and we're not allowed to invade them. But on the other hand, we just have an open border, and then, it does cause problems. And I'm sensitive to that. And I think the solution is further integration, not building a wall and forgetting about Mexico, forgetting that they exist and being separate, but saying, look, we occupy the same continent, we share the same destiny. We're going to eventually integrate. We need to have a structured program for that. And that involves, first and foremost, taking out the cartels. That would involve military action jointly between the Mexican and American military. We need to integrate our command structure together, as well as we might need to engage in some drug legalization. We've already made progress on marijuana, but we might need to legalize cocaine. And maybe that is going to have some harmful externalities, but what it's also going to do is it's going to destroy the profits of the cartels. Because if these drugs are legal, then the cartels, their source of money dries up. Now, they do make money by holding up gas stations and hostages and kidnappings and other things as well. So you're never going to fully eliminate them until you actually use force. So I'm not saying there's a peaceful way out of this, but the sooner we do it, the better, because the longer we ignore the problem, the more people are going to die and suffer as a result. So I think we should be confrontational, but we should also be cooperative, because Mexico isn't a monolith. 90% plus of Mexicans don't have cartel ties. They don't have a positive view of the cartel. They're not, and there's many different cartels as well. So, I mean, even in that case, there's going to be different approaches for different cartels. I'm hopeful that at some point, some of those cartels could be integrated into the Mexican government in the same way that we integrated the Confederacy after the Civil War. We didn't kill all the Confederate officers. We said, okay, you can't vote for 17 years or something. And then we reintegrated them into society, and, we had a gentleman's agreement. Now, for good or evil, it resulted in Jim Crow. It resulted in a lot of ugly things as well. But I think in terms of practical, this is how politics works. Sometimes you're going to use force against the cartels, and then other cartels are going to say, whoa, that's scary. Can we make a deal? And then you make it. I mean, that happens in plea bargains all the time. So it also happens in terms of international politics and military conflict. I mean, there were Nazis in NATO after World War II, right? Nixon went to China. So these kind of odd bedfellows happen all the time. I'm not just in favor of slaughtering everybody, but there is some force that's necessary.
Well, I mean, just on that note, like, I think a smart plan to do would be, if they're going to, try to establish or, have some kind of confrontation with the cartels. What they ought to do is like what the America has always done in Latin America, which is find one that's the horse you're going to bet on, and then back them to kill all the other ones. Like wouldn't that be the smart way to do it? It would just be to like fund or favor one cartel over the others. However, getting back to North American immigration, I've often thought about this. I'm Canadian, so I think that it is a kind of manifest destiny. However, I don't know what is going to have to happen, because for some kind of North American integration, either the two countries, Mexico and Canada, would have to be okay with submitting sovereignty to the United States, or even less likely, the United States would have to be okay with submitting some of its own sovereignty to the kind of collective, which I definitely don't see happening. So, yeah, that's like one of these weird Gordian knots where it seems like it's going to happen, but I just don't see how.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the ways that this can happen is like you take a look at California, which is, next to, I think Texas might even have more Mexican Americans, but I think it probably is actually California. So California has a large Mexican American population, and it's also pretty left wing, and it has a lot of economic ties to Mexico just because people go back and forth, people do jobs. It's a huge part of the Californian economy. You have this weird social stratification in California where very rich people are happy because they can afford housing and they can have jobs and they can live good lives. And then very poor people, immigrant populations, who are kind of sliding under the radar. They're maybe not being paid minimum wage. They're kind of escaping some of the regulations that China has in place, or excuse me, that was a Freudian slip, that California has in place. But it's the middle class people. It's the people in the middle who are citizens. They are subject to the taxes and regulations. They can't get around it. They can't slide under the table and take $7 an hour. And so they're the ones who are getting hit really hard, and they're fleeing the state. And the projection for California is that even if Mexican immigration was totally halted tomorrow, it would still become gradually more Hispanic in character. And I also believe that it's going to continue to be very economically important. So while the majority of the United States is, as you say, fairly hostile to the necessary steps that would need to be taken for this kind of integration, I think you can look toward California as a concentrated area of wealth and power and ideology and demographics where, if you just kind of split off California from the rest of the country, you say like, oh, you know what, integration with Mexico seems more likely.
But like again, I think you have a very optimistic view of how like the people who escape Latin America think. I think they're much more likely to want to kick away the ladder to the to the other people, the situation that they got out of, rather than say, oh, let's let all of these people in. That's just maybe that's like from what I understand the situation to be anecdotally. Maybe there's nothing to back that up. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree with you that you look at South African opposition to immigration, and they're clearly about kicking away the ladder because all of those people are immigrants as well. I mean, none of those people very few of them are Khoisan indigenous people. So absolutely, it's the case that I saw an interview with a woman from the Caribbean in Canada, and she was asked, what's on your mind, and she was like, we got to get rid of these Indians. And it's like, aren't you an immigrant? Like, oh yeah, but these Indians are out of control. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this is the tendency of new immigrant groups is they want to kick away the ladder.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting, when I talk about integration, I'm not suggesting that we have hundreds of millions of Hispanics flowing into the country in a short period of time or anything like that. What I'm saying is that we need to become more proactive in our dealings with Mexico. We can't be reactive. We can't just wait for the cartel to sneak in. We can't just build a wall and segregate them off and say, okay, we don't have to worry about them anymore, because our economic future is tied more to Mexico than anyone else. And the reason for that is even though right now we have a lot of trade with China, we have a lot of trade with Europe. I mean, we probably have more trade with the Middle East or something, and various other countries than we do with Mexico alone. So Mexico is not our biggest trading partner. But when you're considering the fact that we've had a global economy for a few centuries, but that's not normal. Like, having a global economy is fragile. It takes a lot of infrastructure. You have to have basically a small number of hegemonic navies that can control global shipping routes. If you don't have that, you can kiss the global economy goodbye. Now, that's not something that I'm trying to manifest or something that I want to happen, but we should consider that as a possible risk. And in order to guard against that, to not put all our eggs in one basket, we have to develop close economic ties that are less fragile. And the number one, answer to that question is we've got Mexico, which has a healthy demographic situation. Actually, where we offshore a lot of our car companies and factories, do we outsource them to Mexico? Because it has a similar demographic and economic profile to China, in that people are willing to accept lower wages. And, that's just a fertile environment for companies to set up shop and do that sort of thing. So Mexico is going to be our primary partner. I mean, increasingly is going to be a much more important partner for us than some of these countries that are on the other side of the world. Now, I don't want that to happen. I want us to maintain close relationships wherever we can. But just in terms of the long-term, in terms of a crisis scenario, in terms of, okay, we have a world war scenario, or we have a global economic recession or collapse, or Trump gets us out of NATO, or whatever the situation is, the best way to prepare for that is to be proactive in our relationship with Mexico. Not just to say, okay, well, they can burn in hell, and if the cartels take over, that's their problem, not our problem. It's like, no, we share a destiny on this continent. I mean, this is just the story of America. So let's be proactive about it. Not invite millions of Mexicans into the country and put them on welfare, whatever the scarecrow or whatever the worst case scenario is. But say, like, we need to go into Mexico. We need to partner, and sometimes it's carrot and stick, and sometimes it's saying, okay, if you don't want to cooperate with us, we can punish you with trade. We can punish you with tariffs. Or we can cooperate. And I think that's an effective strategy for being proactive. I'm not saying all the problems can be solved tomorrow, but we should start today rather than waiting for global trade to collapse. And then we're like, oh, shit, we got to solve this problem, because it's probably going to get worse if we ignore it.
Yeah. And I mean, the other upside to, engagement is that I think like by 2100, like Mexico's projected to be like a middle power, right? So, they've got a lot of Hispanic people living in that border area. That is like a powder keg recipe of like a sort of like rising, more assertive country with a bunch of their, ethnic Latino people living right on the border region, right? So that's something that causes conflict like throughout history. So if you don't, have that engagement, then it could turn into more of a kind of adversarial relationship, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty hopeful that wouldn't happen. I mean, obviously, my plan would reduce that risk by saying, okay, let's not wait until Mexico is so strong that they're hard to assimilate into American culture. Let's start now.
Yeah.
I mean, Mexico, it's an important country in Central America. I'm not saying they're a weak country, but they have a lot of problems. We could help them. They can help us. Let's cooperate.
Sure.
Let's integrate. And I think Canada has a good system. They have English and French, and everyone's supposed to be bilingual. And I think we should have the same system in America. Everyone speaks Spanish and they speak English. And we work toward integration. And obviously, English is a global lingua franca. I mean, people speak it in Europe, people learn it in China. And so it's important, and in Africa as well. So I think it's important to move eventually toward a goal of, we'll just default to English after a certain period of time. But there's stages. I mean, this is a process. It's not something that you get done in 5 years. But I think it would be good at a very high level to say, you know what, over the next 5 years, what we're going to do is we're going to create a unified military command structure between Mexico and America that is resistant to cartel infiltration. Currently, the Mexican government has a problem where they're infiltrated by the cartels. How can you fight the cartels if you're infiltrated by them? So we need a
Yeah.
top-down command structure that's resistant to that type of infiltration. And then we also need to judge in terms of harm reduction, where is it appropriate to decriminalize drugs in order to cut off sources of revenue to the cartel? Then we need to figure out, okay, what sort of border security do we need to restrict the flow of drugs to reduce their revenues? And then we actually need to come up with a battle plan of how are we going to go in and which cartels are we going to come at, fast and furious, and which cartels are we going to say, look, we just made an example of the other guys. Do you want to negotiate, or do you want to do this the hard way? And I think again, some of them at the leadership level are probably going to say, let's make a deal. You give us a blanket amnesty or something like that. In some cases, Bukele in El Salvador has had his own solution. Trump actually says, he says he locked them all up, but what he actually did is he sent them to America. And I don't think I think it's not really either or. I think probably a lot of those gang members did flee to America, independent of Bukele sending them here. And I think he did lock up a lot of them as well. So, I think if you have a very clear vision of what you want to do, it's a solvable problem. And then once you solve the cartel problem, then you can kind of breathe a sigh of relaxation and say, you know what? It's no longer about the drug and the crime and the rapists. Actually, Mexican crime rates are not when you eliminate the cartels, these are not like ferocious animals or something who are just so impulsive. I mean, I've been to some of the worst place in Mexico, and the average person is like an American. I mean, they're slightly overweight. They like to play mini golf. They go to the movies. They watch American movies with Spanish, dubbing or subbing. And, they're not like an incredibly hostile. It's not like a primitive tribe in the Amazon who's going to like shoot you with bows and arrows and stuff because you look different from them. I mean, they've had, Caucasian presidents, and they just elected a Jewish president. I mean, these are not like the backwards, Stone Age peoples or something. So we can integrate them. We have a lot of them coming into America. Again, I don't think it's the best thing in the world, but I don't think I mean, if I was in charge, would I have a different immigration policy than we've had for the last, 60 years or whatever? Sure. But, given that we are where we are, there's certain, instead of crying tears over spilled milk, we can move forward and we can salvage the situation. I don't think like, oh gosh, there's 30 million illegal Mexicans living here, and this is going to destroy our civilization. And I'm worried about a lot more things than that, I suppose.
Yeah, no, and when it comes to like mass immigration, I do think it suits some countries other than others. Like, I think it's really the only option for Canada because it's so underpopulated. There's no way that the birth rate's ever going to rebound. So mass immigration is really the only solution to the like underpopulation problem. However, on the other hand, for Western Europe, I think it's toxic because I think that those countries have a different sense of nationalism, and they have a very different attitude towards like ethnicity and patriotism than we have in North America, or at least certainly than we have in Canada. So the multicultural model and the mass immigration model, I don't think works as well in Western Europe, or at least most Western European countries. I'm thinking mainly of France and Germany here.
Yeah, I mean, the primary objective for Europe right now is to create lasting cultural structures, not just an economic union, not even just an.
Sorry, hang on. I'm just gonna. Did my mic died here? Hang on.
Okay, your mic is still going.
Yeah. My camera. Sure.
So essentially, with regard to Europe, I think ultimately, in order to prevent, kind of yet another continental European war, the best way to prevent that is through cultural integration. How do you do that? It's difficult. It's not easy. I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to have a general crisis. Then you unite everybody, and that's kind of what's going on And Ukraine right now that's the focus, maybe propagandistically, but the idea is that we're all European nations and we stand together and we're gonna form this common fighting force. And it's still Europe has a lot of problems. It has industrial problems, economic problems, demographic problems, and certainly immigration is aggravating a lot of pro EU sentiment, like it's like Marine Le Pen's party or the AFD. These are Eurosceptic parties. Brexit was a Eurosceptic party or movement, and they all are tied to anti-immigration sentiment. So I think if you're trying to unify Europe at this time, there's a danger in allowing in massive numbers of refugees who are
Yeah.
associated with crime and what happened in Rotherham in England as the sexual assaults. And so I think that accepting in a lot of refugees might not be ideal for Europe at this juncture. I don't know how many more it can handle before you start to get some, or you just worsen the situation. So I think Europe could handle a bit more merit-based or high-skilled immigration, whether that's from Asia or anywhere else. I think it would be less threatening to the political stability of the European project to have some high-skilled merit-based immigration. And I would say regarding Canada, I don't see the need to populate Canada. Like, I don't see the need. Like, I don't view Canada as an independent entity. I view it like Alaska. Like, Alaska's this big barren wasteland. If people want to move there, they can move there. But I don't feel the need to take people who obviously are in much poorer countries and to say, oh, here's a ticket to Canada. And of course, they're all going to take the ticket because they want to live in a wealthy country. But I don't know how beneficial that is to America, because I'm not coming at this from like a pro, like I'm not trying to make Canada into a superpower or anything. I just view Canada as like a colony or a little cousin of America. And I see Canada as I'm glad Canada exists and it's got a lot of resources. And I hope that, as climate change progresses, Canada is helpful toward, we're going to redirect agricultural resources toward Canada. People will just naturally move into Canada as the climate changes, I think. So yeah, I don't feel the need to. What I would approve for Canada is I think we should have an open border between America and Canada. I think we should just become one country. And I think a lot of Canadians would move south, and some Americans would move north. But I don't have a desire to Matthew Iglesias says we need 1 trillion Canadians. I don't know if that's necessary or desirable.
Well, the plan is to have 100 million by 2100. So that they're on course for that. They may even exceed that at this rate.
Yeah, I don't know that's I'm not just in favor of more people as a general. Like, for example, I mean
One thing I would say though is that the way that the if industrialization proceeds apace, and let's say East Asia is pretty much industrialized at this point. South Asia's on the way. Sub-Saharan Africa at some point in the next 50 years could make moves to being the next kind of industrial area. So what's going to happen in the future is people are going to be, the rich countries in particular, are going to be competing for immigrants. It's not going to be like keeping people out. The only way to actually achieve some kind of growth, which that's the model now, maybe that will change, but is going to be these countries that are offering better incentives for the immigrants to come, right? So when I say that, Canada needs more people, I mean in order to kind of build a more sustainable structure for being in that kind of competition between for immigrants, which I think will become more salient kind of later in the century.
Yeah, I don't think Canada needs to compete. I think they can sit this one out, and I think they're going to be fine being a big open space. I don't think that's an economic necessity. I think that to the extent that countries will compete for high-skilled immigrants, that's that's not ever going to lead to 100 million Canadians. I think that, yeah, I think on net, like in specific areas, like certain forms of limited merit based immigration are a net economic positive. But I think just importing millions and millions of people without, like, again, I can justify Mexican immigration on the grounds of, geography, but Canada shares a border with America. It doesn't share a border with India or China or something like that. So I don't think it's ultimately going to be beneficial from America's point of view. I just don't view Canada as an independent state. I see it as a proxy of America, whatever term you want to use. And I think we should formalize that relationship and not think of Canada as an independent entity. I think that's like a falsehood at this point. Maybe it was true
I
300 years ago.
I mean, yeah, at this point they're operating an independent policy. I kind of, in a philosophical sense, agree. However, I don't think that's the context that any of the, policymakers are really operating under at this point.
They got to change. They got to catch up to speed. They got to get on the
Yeah.
program here. So, yeah, I would have some disagreements with those policymakers. But yeah, I don't know how much time you have left today. We've already hit the hour mark. So,
Sure.
um,
Yeah, sure. We can wrap it up.
I want to give you. I think we've gone through a lot of topics here. So I want to give you
Yeah.
the floor. Final thoughts, last words. You know,
Uh,
thoughts for the future, what you're working on, what you're reading, and who you recommend we check out.
oh, who do I recommend you check out? Yeah, so I guess I'll return back to where we started. Yeah, I mean, I'm working on some longer form stuff. It's kind of hard to like juggle posting articles. I don't know how you do it. I think you're like the hardest working guy on Substack because you have either an article or an interview coming out every day, sometimes multiple times a day. I don't know how you do it. So yeah, it's hard for me to juggle. And the other thing is that I don't know if I really have a lot to say. Like I don't want to write something just for the sake of, oh, I need to make myself visible or something. So if I don't have anything to say, I'm just, yeah, I'll forget about it. But if there was somebody to check out, particularly to kind of contextualize some of the stuff I was talking about in the beginning, it's this philosopher who I really didn't know about him until very recently, called Hans Georg Gadamer. He's a continental philosopher, but he's fairly accessible by continental standards, and I think a lot of, in particular, his critique of the human sciences is something I'm really interested in, and I'm kind of like working on something related to that in the future.
Awesome. Okay, we will be
Yeah.
looking
Cool.
forward to that.
Cool. Thanks, man. Thanks
Yeah,
for having me.
absolutely. Good talk, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Sure. Cool, man. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah.
All right. You got to like, you got to comment, you got to restack, you got to share on Twitter. Do all those good things. And I got to go to bed. It's late. It's a different time. We got to match up our time zones. It's late. I got to go to sleep, guys. Night, night. Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye bye.